Hello, Mindvalley. This is Kristina co-founder of Mindvalley and the host of Mindvalley Book Club. And today I have a very interesting guest and a very interesting book. And for those of you who actually know me for a while, you might guess why this book was particularly interesting to me. Although I have to say that our books of the week are actually picked by a panel of pro readers, not just me alone, even if I might be biased to the topic of the book. So today I have a guest, Karthik Ramanna. Welcome, Karthik.
Thank you for having
Sorry,
me, Kristina.
I'm still concerned if I'm pronouncing your name well.
You're doing it
But
fabulously.
I
No trouble at all.
thank you. By the title of the book that you wrote, I'm sure you can take it impersonally if I occasionally mispronounce your name. So the book that we're going to first, I'll introduce my guest, and then I will talk about the book. And actually, I will show you the book, but we'll talk about the book with Kartik. But meanwhile, I want to ask you to do the traditional, just say hi in the chat. I do have Masha with me now in the background, so if anything, she will be, she will be the connection between you and me, because as ever, I'm standing quite far away from my computer, so I rely on sound. So today's book of the week is The Age of Outrage, and I'm very happy to announce that this is the book of the week for several reasons. One of them, of course, is because we pick the most exciting, the most interesting books that are recently released. But I guess the other reason is that this topic has been cropping up a little bit every once in a while. So I think it is an important topic. And maybe you remember a while ago, we were talking about the world polarizing. Now, this book is talking from a different aspect about the polarization of the world, but I think it is a recurring topic in the books that come out right now. So I'm really happy to continue this topic because it does bother me personally a lot. Now, thank you guys for saying that you're here. I'm, as ever, in Estonia, and my guest Kartik today is in Washington, D.C. And before we go for the book, I have to give a few words. So Kartik is the professor of business and public policy in Oxford University Blavatnik School of Government. Previously, he used to be a professor at Harvard Business School, so I've already pronounced two of the most impressive educational institutions in the world in just like half a sentence. And as you can see, he is speaking to us from the orbit. Well, that's not the last. The last bit is not true. He also has won several prizes for his work, not just academically, but for example, a prize from Harvard Business Review. I have to check it out. McKinsey Prize for groundbreaking management thinking, and three case center prizes, which are, by the way, supposed to be the Oscars of the business school, according to Financial Times. So I did use my cheat sheet a little bit, but Karthik, tell me if I have to add something else, which I didn't mention.
No, thank you for that very kind introduction. And I am delighted to be here and to talk about this book. Sadly, as you've mentioned, Kristina, this is a topic that is so relevant. And I wish we wouldn't have to be talking about a book about how to lead in a polarized world, but this is the time we live in. And so let's see if we can make the most of the situation and certainly avoid making it worse.
Thank you. And I want to encourage people who are with us online to actually share with us if you have had experience of, personal experience of being in the midst of a polarizing conflict. And if you're watching it in recording, you can also share it in the comments, because I think the communication around the video, around the interview is always helpful and, well, supportive. Karthik, the question to you. So I know that in somewhere in the beginning of the book, you do mention that your definition of leadership is a little bit different than traditional, maybe, your school definition of leadership. And you do teach the future leaders of the world, people like prime ministers and presidents, apparently. I found out from reading the book. But who did you write this book for? It has a very strong leadership aspect, and obviously, most of the examples that you bring are from leaders of the level which, for most of us ordinary people, are probably not in our plans. But who did you write this book for, and who is it useful for?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, in my mind, a leader is someone who leaves a situation better than they found it. So anyone can really be a leader. You walk into a context of deep polarization, can you leave it better than you found it? If so, you can be a leader in that situation. And so, you don't need to necessarily have a lot of positional power in order to be an effective leader. You can sometimes lead and very effectively lead from, at sort of the middle of the organization, or even as a starter in an organization. So that for me, rather than anchor leadership on positional authority, I want to anchor it on personality. And, how do you bring the best version of yourself to a situation that could use improvement? And how can you leave it, therefore, better than you found it? And so I hope that the book appeals to all people who want to make, the situation they are in a little better for others. Importantly, leadership is about serving others. If you're leading for yourself, then you're not really leading. So it is about leaving the situation better for others. So I hope that this is a book that will resonate widely. But as you say, some of the case studies that the book draws on are from people who are in very, very tough and challenging situations at the top of large organizations. So when I wrote the book, it was important to me that we didn't sort of get too bogged down in sort of the nature of the organization. I said, it could be a business, it could be a not-for-profit, it could be a government. So some of the case studies deal with for-profit companies. Some of the case studies deal with if you're a mayor of a city or a police commissioner or of a police force. Some of them deal with heads of not-for-profits and so forth. So I think the sector matters less. But importantly, this is a book for organizational leadership. And what I mean by that is it's not necessarily a book about, how to drive political change. This is not a book about, sort of using policy making to build new legislation or things like that. This is very much a book about personal effectiveness in the context of an organizational setting, any kind of organization, business, government, not-for-profit.
Mhm. And for those of you who haven't read the book yet, I warmly recommend, because even if you feel that maybe you are not that leader who can leave the situation better than you found it, it is a very engaging narrative. It actually is so relevant to our everyday life, to actually contemporary life. And by contemporary, I mean like right now, February, and not 5 years ago. So it is very engaging. It's very interesting. It's very provocative, the conversation. I mean, it's not provocative in the sense where, you can see my guest, but it is going to provoke you because these issues are important and anxiety provoking, I would say. So uh, I guess let's start with, so the book is very thorough. It actually dissects the nature of our polarized world and how to deal with that as an organization. But you can get to know the book in more detail if you get it, and we'll traditionally share the links with you. But what I want to ask is that you do talk about in the very beginning about the three drivers of outrage and outrage in general. Maybe, since you're an academic person, we'll start with definitions. How much more outraged are we now compared to, let's say, the history? And what are the three drivers? Sorry, two questions in one, too.
No, it's a useful place for us to start, because then we can sort of anchor. You can't solve a problem without understanding what is the problem, right? So there's this famous quote from Einstein. He says, "Give me an hour to save the world. I'll spend 55 minutes defining the problem and 5 minutes solving it." So it's important to start with this issue of, what do we mean by an age of outrage? And I think there are, as you've said, three factors that are driving us here. The first is a sense of deep fear for the future, right? Some of this could be driven by technological changes like AI, which promises to really transform society on a scale at least as great as the Industrial Revolution, if not greater. But then there are also concerns around, climate change. There are also concerns around demographic shifts. So much of the Western world is aging actually quite rapidly. And by the year 2050, half of all the people under the age of 18 will be in sub-Saharan Africa. So the world's going to look very different. And people look ahead to the world of 15, 20 years from now, and they're afraid that it's not going to be like the world they've come to get used to, at least, in the period since the end of World War II, which is sort of when we've roughly lived in a common era. And so that's sort of the first driver of polarization, this fear of the future. The second driver is a sense of, feeling cheated by our leaders and by our institutions, what I call in the book a sense of a raw deal. People feel like, the system hasn't worked in the context, for instance, of particularly Western societies, particularly countries like the United States and Western Europe. People were fed a narrative around, globalization. They were fed a narrative around offshoring, and they were fed a narrative around immigration. And those narratives haven't panned out, except perhaps for a few, maybe top 10% in society. So people feel like the leaders in society, those who are at sort of driving the key institutions in society, whether they're institutions of government or institutions of business or even sort of civic institutions like churches, et cetera, they've really failed us. And so there's this sense of this raw deal. And so if you had just the fear of the future and deep trust for the institutions, as we did say during World War II, then maybe we'd be okay. But the fact is we have both of these things happening at the same time. And that actually brings this third factor in, which we call ideologies of othering. So, for a long time, at least for the last 200 years, the dominant thought in certainly Western philosophy was that of humanist enlightenment. The idea that, through the pursuit of knowledge, we would all sort of create a better future for global humanity. And of course, there were all kinds of historical injustices and so forth. But at least since the end of World War II, this Enlightenment policy was very much what was sort of underlining a lot of how the world worked. And what we're seeing is sort of a breakdown of that Enlightenment consensus, a breakdown of seeing the world in global humanist terms and going back to our innate tribal instincts to see the world in us versus them terms. So, being able to say, well, these are my people and those are not my people, et cetera. So you put these three things together, the fear of the future, the sense of the raw deal, and the growing sense of othering. And it gives us what I call the age of outrage. All of these features have always been present in human history. But at least since the end of World War II, we haven't had all of these features present at once at the same time. And that's what makes this a particularly difficult age for us to grapple with.
So this age is new to humanity. It's not like this has happened before and we have survived and here we are still alive.
Well, I mean, in recent memory, I'll say,
Recent
yes, of course,
memory.
we've had, I'd say in the last 80 years, this is distinctive. Of course, we've had periods, I mean, World War II was a deeply devastating event, wiped out, tens of millions of people and so forth. We'd very much like to avoid a scenario like that, right? So I think
Yeah.
there's a general consensus, regardless of, one's political or partisan identity, that we'd like to avoid that kind of war because our technology is really so devastating today. But at least since the end of World War II, we haven't had to grapple with this kind of confluence of these forces, and they're really tearing apart our institutions and our society.
So I'll ask a question which is not directly related to the book, but considering your background, I had to ask that. Do you think we, humanity, contemporary humanity, we are capable of learning from history, or do you think it's only for the academics to know that it's dangerous, but the layman, do we actually make any conclusions from what had happened, even from the World War II?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think one of the important lessons of history is to understand how path dependent the course of humanity can be. Right, having
Mm,
the right people at the right time in moments of history are tremendously important. Having the right sentiments and the right conversations in history are tremendously important to shaping the way things are. So when we try understand how something why something is the way it is in the world today, it's not because we want to say, oh, this is our destiny, so we can't do anything about it. Look, it happened before,
mm.
etc. We understand it so that we can change it, so that we can do something differently, right? I'm a professor, and one of the reasons I'm a professor is because I am innately an optimistic person. I spend my time teaching because I feel like by teaching, why something is the way it is, we can craft a better world. And so, yes, of course, I'm very optimistic about, our possibilities to do things. But of course, we could screw it up. We could do it really wrong badly as well.
So, those of you who are planning to read the book, that's a very important thing to keep in mind, that the author is a very optimistic professor. Because in the beginning, Karthik, you do give a very grim menu of our current problems that we have to deal with. So, I guess what I want to ask is, I was very curious about the actual statistics of that the society is not evenly progressing through history or becoming richer, if I can say so, that the gap is actually widening. And I'm talking in general terms, not just within, let's say, Western society or between the so-called civilizations. Which is a fairly scary thing. And then you just mentioned the idea of enlightenment. Now, why I'm asking this question is because I was born and raised in Soviet Union, another very messed up ideology, which fortunately failed in my country at least. Did so is our Western thought flawed? Is because I understand that the widening gap is the result of this capitalist liberal society. Is it flawed, or are we just, I don't know, are we just misunderstanding what's going on? Is it still the only way forward? Because I also wouldn't want to hear the communist sentiment growing louder.
No. So that's a really important question. And let me preface it with nobody really knows, right? And so
Mhm.
Churchill famously said of democracy, it's the worst system of government we can think of, except for everything else. So, right. And so in some sense, the idea that we choose our leaders and then they over time, shape us, but they are accountable to us. So every so often we take them to the ballot and we determine whether they've done a good job. And if so, then we keep them in office. If not, we find new leaders. That's usually and generally been a very good idea through sort of, human history. And at times in which we have abandoned that, we have found ourselves being sort of, effectively misled by people. And because, yes, you can have from time to time an authoritarian leader who is, sort of really benevolent, but, the odds that that will sustain over multiple generations are close to zero. So the idea of having some sort of democratic accountability seems like generally a good idea. Also, throughout human history, the idea of enabling individuals to pursue their own, self-actualization through their own sort of industry, through their own entrepreneurship, is also something that has been very compelling. Suppressing the human spirit entirely for the benefit of the collective has, proved to be disastrous for the general welfare of humanity. It's usually a great system for the people at top, but it's not so great a system for everybody else. But at the same time, as you say, and particularly now with technology being what it is, the returns to some of the innovation and progress we've seen in society accrue to those at the very top. So yes, we have this democratic system, and yes, we have this, generally free capitalist system, but because of the technological skewness in society, because of the fact that these technologies are so impressive and so difficult to permeate for most humans, a small section of society really understands them and really is able to capitalize on them and does very well financially as a result. And so, over time, society needs to address that. And perhaps the pendulum swung too far in one direction, and now it needs to correct a little. And so, a part of the reason I wrote this book, and of course, many other people work in this area, is that to recognize that we are in a moment that requires a course correction, but it doesn't require a course overcorrection, right? And
Mm.
so, because of course, if you overcorrect, you create new problems, and those have their own disasters. So I think it's recognizing that things have gone wrong, but also recognizing that you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Right. And that's the nuance that we have to sort of work our way through. And so one of the core ideas in the book, as you say, the book is very much a book about solutions rather than the chapter we talked about on why the outrage is really just one of 7 chapters
Yeah.
of the book. The rest of the book is on solutions. And the core premise of the book is how can leaders navigate all of this uncertainty? Just like I don't know how we solve this problem at the grand structural level, I don't think anybody knows. I'd be
Mm.
astonished if we had, one person who has this all figured out and says
Mhm.
this is the way to do it. So what we want to
I think if somebody
yeah.
said that they have figured it out and I can do it, it's a definitely sign of danger.
It's a little bit of a red flag, right? Yeah. So what the book is really about is, okay, how do we navigate that? How do we get people to try things? We can't just say, oh, there's no problem and therefore do nothing, which is what, some of the people in the establishment are sort of, they had their head in their head in sand, right? So they're refusing to acknowledge that the sort of post-war liberal consensus, global consensus that we built is effectively losing its legitimacy, and we need to sort of reimagine the system. But we want to reimagine it with all of its good things and addressing some of its bad things. And that's the sense in which we need to, muddle through, the British say, these decisions. And I think that's probably a sensible way for us to handle this challenge.
So the book is actually on solutions, majority of the book, but I like in my interviews to take the premise and talk about the problem, because I believe that you guys should get the book to go through the solutions. I do want to ask, maybe shift a little bit, because the book does talk more, it's centered around the solutions for the organizations. Again, it's not important which organizations, but organizations, and it's relevant for a lot of us. But I want to ask, first I'll ask our audience probably, can you think of the situation where you were afraid of being cancelled, whether you are the face of organization or not? I know that we in Mindvalley, we are quite vocal about politics, for example. We've expressed our opinions about US presidential elections, about the wars, about the conflicts. And it always comes with, with a dilemma. Do I stand for what I believe in and talk about that openly and maybe lose business, or do I pretend to be indifferent, or I don't know, neutral, the Switzerland? Now, the question to you, Karthik, so on a personal level, because one thing is to be the leader, but I do think that the system depends on us, every single human being, even if I'm just a tiny cog in the machine. And we do make the situation worse by playing along that game. So on a personal level, is there anything that you wish everyday human would understand and stop being so damn stupid?
So, I mean, look, for me, two things have really helped me navigate, one of the reasons why I wrote the book, and maybe I'll just divert a little and talk about the story of that, is I came about 8 years ago from Harvard to Oxford, as you said, to be the director of the Master of Public Policy program at Oxford. And, every year, as you indicated, we assemble about 100 to 150 public leaders from around the world, 60, 70 different countries. These are incredibly smart people. They're incredibly committed people. And they're people who really sort of, have taken a year out of a very, very impactful life to spend together at Oxford. So I remember my first day as director standing in front of the class and saying, gosh, Karthik, at the very least, don't screw this up, right? But perhaps, you should be more aspirational that and say, leave this situation better than you found it. You brought these remarkable people together. We're living in this age of deep uncertainty. How can I leave these people better than I found them? And so I did the thing, this is an inside secret, that many professors do when they don't know an answer to a question. The question was, how do you lead in a polarized world? I don't know. So what did I do? I taught a course on it. I decided to offer a class called How to Lead in a Polarized World. And I was very frank with the students. I said, look, I don't know, you don't know, but what we'll do is we'll understand what is going on in the world, and we'll bring maybe so every week, we brought to class a guest. And my rule was, they had to be someone who is running something. So they could be a mayor or a governor or a police commissioner or a CEO or, president, whatever it might be. But they had to be running something. And that was my only rule. And so I said to them, bring to us, the class, your hardest problem in the context of being this general manager
Mhm.
who's running something. but don't tell us what the solution you came up with. Just bring the problem, describe the problem, and let us as a class see if we can find a way around it. So it was through that process of bringing in, over the course of the 6-7 years that I taught that course, dozens of these, high profile organizational leaders, that I then started searching for a solution. And I said, is there, across all of these various things that these leaders have tried in different settings, is there a common thread running through it, right? And that's actually where the story of the book comes from, and the solutions in the book come from, is saying what is common across things that have worked, but also what is common across things that have not worked, right? Because we learn as much from failure as we do from success. And so it was putting all those things together that brought us this. And so the book will then take you through, various parts, of 5-part framework, and say, okay, you got to do all these 5 things. But to go back to your original question and say, what is my sort of, secret? And so for me, 2 things I've taken away from this. One is, no matter what you do, you're not going to solve the whole problem. Just have a sense of perspective on it, right? So you're coming in as organizational leader, dealing with polarization. Don't imagine for a moment that you're going to be able to solve the whole problem. And in fact, that modesty in saying, okay, well, so what is the part of the problem I can leave better than I found? That actually means you devote your attention on something achievable, which will then actually have tangible results, right? So no matter what, don't try to solve the whole problem, because you won't be able to do it, and then you'll end up doing nothing at all. The second is also have a sense of perspective. No matter what you do, you will be seen as part of the problem, right? Because this is the idea that we're living in this polarized world. And, I mean, some people want revolutionary change, and I can't, I mean, that's their prerogative. And they will experience something like I'm doing as not enough. And I say, I can't attempt in a leadership role. I mean, again, it doesn't matter whether you're in a positional power or whether you're at the bottom of an organization. You can't attempt in a leadership role to please everyone. Because if you try to please everyone, you'll please no one, right? You'll not accomplish anything tangible. So you have to have the confidence and the comfort with yourself to say, okay, here's a part of the problem that I can leave better than I found. Let me focus on that. Let me deliver actionable, tangible results on that. And let me recognize that, that's going to leave some people upset with me, but that's okay. When I think that I've given it my all and now it is someone else's turn, I step back and let them do what they think needs to be done, right? And George Washington, the first president of the United States, he could have very easily made himself emperor, when he was so popular at the end of his second term. And in fact, his contemporary in France, Napoleon, did crown himself emperor around the same time.
Oh, wow.
Said, actually, you know what? I've done it. I've done what I can do. And now the rest is for my countrymen to figure out. And, they have to make the best of this opportunity we've given them. And I think it's that sense of perspective. Have an impact. I mean, Washington had a tremendous impact, but he also had this sense of humility, which is an essential part of leadership, to know when to.
And he also didn't have Instagram where he would see Napoleon boasting every day.
Well, so I actually don't engage in social media. I know this is crazy, but in this world, but part of the advantage of being sort of a professor is you don't have to. I do have an Instagram account, but actually the inside secret is my husband manages it, not me. So right.
Well,
and yeah.
So, I'm a side note, I'm really happy that the quotes that I wrote out for myself, you actually were talking about those things. So I guess I picked up the right things from the book. But since now that you've mentioned your husband, I want to ask a somewhat related question. You do talk in the very beginning of the book about how one of your students blamed you as being part of the establishment, which is, of course, absolutely ironic. But what I wanted to ask is, isn't this kind of blame throwing at each other? Sometimes we don't even know the background, because I'm also often called privileged based on some external factors. But, I was born in Soviet Union. I do not know how privileged that is. Isn't that also a little bit part of the symptom that we blame the establishment, for example, and then we make such blatant mistakes where, you know, you are not part of it. When we have this blame game or this cancellation process, do we even understand the whole picture, or is it just a bunch of emotions flying around and there's no substance behind it?
So what's important is, as a leader, you have to recognize that fault in yourself, but you can't necessarily point out that fault in others. Because if you did, you're not going to be able to have their trust, right? The only way to earn someone's trust is to actually do something rather than, you know. So imagine I'm a leader, I'm probably just as susceptible to that kind of mental sort of framing where I see someone and say, oh, this person must be privileged and, you know, they're trying to sort of, you know, oppress me and so forth. I might be. So I have to, as a leader, say, okay, if I really want to be impactful in this situation, I need to be able to snap out of that and say, okay, how can I, you know, work through everything that's been. But if I'm sort of then facing opposition from the people I'm trying to mobilize, I can't say, oh, you guys are biased and you don't see, you know, how
Mm,
hard it is for me and so forth. That will not earn any trust from anyone, right? So the only way you can solve that problem is through your actions. And so,
mm,
yes, I was, you know, some of my students, not all, very few of them, saw me as, you know, perhaps part of the problem. And my only way to handle that was to say, okay, is that a part of something that I want to manage? Because there are lots of things that I can work on. And if it is, the only way I can convince them I'm not part of the problem is through my actions, not by pointing out their biases, right? So
mm,
that's part of so the book actually takes you through some of these behavioral frameworks, you know, and of course, you can use the behavioral frameworks both to understand the people that you want to lead, but importantly, to understand yourself. You know, I use the behavioral frameworks really to understand my own biases,
mm.
more so than to understand anyone else's biases, because I can't do anything about someone else's biases, but I
Yeah.
can do everything about my own biases, and that makes me more effective. So that, I think, is the way
And
I
it
see.
also makes you very wise and not the level of wisdom that maybe we can expect in everyday life, because it does require you to relinquish your ego in this polarized world and focus on something else rather than proving others that they misunderstood you. Um, I wanted to move the conversation somewhere. God, your answer actually took me to a very different orbit, and now I don't remember where I wanted to move the conversation. Let me think about it. You know, yes, what I wanted to ask before this new train of thought was, as a human being, whether you have a team to lead or a company to represent, or maybe a nonprofit, uh, is it important to actually express your opinion, your point of view, and how do you do that without being cancelled?
Yes. So, look, if you're trying to be a leader in a context, um, it's important for you to stand for something. It's important for you to have sort of a conviction around something. You know, people often confuse sort of, because, you know, in leadership, we talk about the value of temperance, and I talked about the value of humility.
Yeah.
People often confuse that temperance or humility with not standing for anything. But actually, if you look through even recent history, some of the most temperate leaders, some of the most sort of thoughtful leaders, people like Mandela or Itzhak Rabin,
Hmm.
it's not like they didn't stand for anything. They were very, very clear. It was very clear what they stood for.
Yeah.
But they knew how to read a room, right? They knew how to set the context in a way that didn't commit themselves too far or didn't commit the people they were trying to lead well beyond their capacity to actually deliver. And that's the
Hmm.
sense in which I think it's that delicate balancing act that you have to get right. So, you know, you can't be a leader if you don't have a sense of conviction about how it is you're going to make the world a better place, right? We said in the beginning of this meeting that leadership is leaving a situation better than you found it. That means you need to have diagnosed the situation, you need to have a plan of action, and then you need to be delivering on it. And you can't be a leader if you say, oh, I'm just going to stand here and make everyone feel good about themselves and not actually deliver anything. Then, you're not getting anywhere. So what you have to do is say, okay, this is the plan and this is what we're going to do. We're going to mobilize people toward that. And you can't be afraid of that. But what makes a leader different is that they are responsible not just for what they say, they are responsible for how their words land on others, right? They're responsible for how they can frame themselves so that they are effective with others. Because imagine, for instance, I need to convince someone about what is important in this world. Right now, part of the reason I'm here in Washington is because I'm trying to drive a program for greater what I want to do is ensure that people in the world are able to get access to all of the energy resources and all of the economic opportunity that they want, but to do it in a way that does not pollute the atmosphere. Right.
Mhm.
So the work becomes very technical very quickly. But it's about, how do you measure the emissions intensity of various products and services and so forth. Now, we're dealing with some people in the current administration in the United States, who may not be sympathetic to this kind of work on climate change, right? So I can say, oh my God, they don't understand climate change and this and that, and they're anti-science and so forth. But then I'm not going to make any progress. I'm not going to be very
Mm.
effective, right? So rather, I say, okay, well, what are the things they do care about? And how can we find commonalities in what it is that we're trying to accomplish, right? So what I need to be thoughtful about is, it's very clear in my mind that we have to find a way to continue to deliver economic prosperity, but without putting out the amount of CO2 we've been putting out into the atmosphere. That's going to be really important. We're going to have to recalibrate that balance, and we're going to have to do it very, very quickly. Otherwise, we're going to be in deep trouble. But if I just said it that way, without thinking through how I build a coalition, how I build consensus around it, I'll probably make no progress, right? And in fact, one of the
Mhm.
challenges with the climate movement right now is that it very much sets things up as almost like an us versus them, like we said earlier about
Mm.
ideologies of othering. So part of the reason why I'm in Washington is to say, okay, how can I frame the message in a way that others who might disagree with what I'm saying will experience it in a way that is still productive for their agenda, right?
Mhm.
That's what an effective leader has to do. And
Mhm.
in any context. So what makes a leader really effective is responsibility, not just for what you say, and there needs to be clarity about what you're saying, but also responsibility for how others experience what you say. That makes
Mhm.
all the difference. And quite frankly,
Mhm.
that is one of the reasons I am not on social media, because I can't
Mhm.
trust myself to be so careful about what I would say in every moment. Because just like
Mm.
everybody else, I have, emotional ups and downs and so forth. And quite frankly, if I were on Twitter, I would say a lot of things that the next day I would not, I was like, damn it, I don't want to say that. Why did I say that? So I just am not. And then when I do say something, I think carefully about it and I say, okay, now I'm ready to say this.
So I'll ask a question which is not in the book, or at least I don't think it is there unless I missed it somehow. Um, Obviously, you do deal with some of the very important problems. And considering I'm from Europe, obviously for me, the climate problem is the top, together with the war happening next to us. And in US, a lot of politicians deny that this even exists as a problem. So how do you keep your optimism when you're pretty much hitting the brick wall in the question of life and death?
So I think it's important, again, not to frame it that way, right? In the book, we talk about no, this is a really powerful in the book we talk about the Stockdale paradox, and it's named for this guy, Admiral James Stockdale. The basically he was a prisoner of war in Vietnam, right?
Mhm.
And many other people that he was captured with, who were prisoners of war at the time, they died in captivity, not because of anything else other than they lost hope, right? So he said, actually, the pessimists, of course, they couldn't deal with because you didn't know if you were ever going to be recovered. And you didn't know, sort of how bad the situation was going to get before if there was any possible recovery and so forth. So the pessimists were finished. And he said the optimists also were finished because they would keep saying, oh, it'll be fine tomorrow, it'll be fine tomorrow, it'll be fine tomorrow. But then, tomorrow came and it wasn't fine. And then tomorrow came after that and it wasn't fine. And so he said it actually requires a combination of both things. It requires a long-term optimism. It requires a long-term belief that you will prevail, but it also requires a deep pragmatic realism, right? That today's reality is what it is, and I just have to deal with that. But I know in the long run, I will find a way. So yes, of course, on the climate problem, here I am in Washington, and I'm going to have to engage with people with whom this is not an issue. I know that one of the reasons why I spend so much of my time on this problem and effectively for free, because I don't get paid for it or anything. I'm doing this just because I think this is the right thing to do, is because I know that in the long run, I can prevail. I can make this system work. But I know that there are 1,000 things that can make me fail today. And I need to be acutely aware of those 1,000 things so that they don't make me fail. Go back to why do we learn history? We learn history so that we're not condemned to repeat it, right? So it's keeping both of these things in mind, right? I would not be a professor if I didn't believe in the long-term sort of human condition and the long-term viability and vitality of the human condition. But I'm also acutely aware of the 1,000 ways every day we can screw that up. And it's both of those things that we need to balance to be effective leaders.
So, Karthik, I have a question which is not a very usual question in this interview. Will you consider writing a book for everyday people, not just the leaders, how to navigate the polarized world and how to not fall into those bubbles of alternate reality or delusion?
That's a great question, and in some sense, I hope the message of the book resonates widely. I mean, it is obviously a book written for people inside organizations, but it could be a book that resonates widely. But you're right. There is a version of this book and this message that can be written for a broader audience. And you put a very interesting idea in my mind, and I hope one day to be able to be back here on this show with you and to be able to discuss that book.
I absolutely think it's necessary because while, yes, we do look up at our leaders to solve our big problems, but we are part of the problem very often by just perpetuating this situation of polarization and refusing to see the other side. Now, we don't have a lot of time. Oh my God, we don't have any time. Oh, I'll ask.
Unfortunately, yes, I have to run.
Oh my
Yeah.
God, I'm so sorry. Guys, I'll do it very quickly. If you haven't read the book yet, do read it. It's very exciting read. Occasionally it is provoking because it will provoke your anxieties about the future, but I think it's important that we don't hide our head in the sand and we actually are clear about where we live, this world where we live. So I do warmly recommend. It's the book of the week by Mindvalley. We will share the link, of course, to Amazon where you can get it. Now, for those of you who are watching live, if you're not part of Mindvalley list yet, then sign up because we do announce the interviews. We share the recordings of the interviews with our list, and we also share every week. We share the up to 5 books which just were released and which we think are interesting. That's how we get our guests. And those of you who are watching in recording, just engage under the recording and do come for our interviews. Now, the question I have for my guest, for Karthik, is, I'll show you the book once again, is this, maybe in line with my last question. For everyday people, if there were 3 things, up to 3 things, maybe just one thing, maybe 2, up to 3 things, which they can do or change right now so that this problem doesn't become any worse, what would you suggest?
That's a lovely question. And I would say, first and foremost, think about what you can do in any context to leave it better than you found it. Rather than think about what others can do to make the situation better, think about what you can do, right? There is this great quote from John Kennedy's inauguration where he says, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And it's that sentiment that I think if everybody just spent 1 hour that way every day, maybe we'd be in a better world.
Mm. Thank you for that. And before I say goodbye, I want to do the traditional. I want to ask our guests who are online to leave a heart for my guest. Just live. If you're watching it in recording, do leave a heart under the video. And Karthik, my last question, I do ask it of every guest. How would you like your book to change the world?
Well, I hope it leaves everyone, thinking about their own personal effectiveness a little more than they have been.
Mm. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful conversation. I did promise to do it very quickly, but I would have actually continued talking. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you, our audience, for joining us live. If you can't join us live, watch us in recording, but join us live because it makes a difference. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.